Hey guys, tonight we begin a quiet walk through a life not fully lived. The kind of life that hums with potential just beneath the surface, but remains unopened, like a letter you never dared to read. Maybe you felt it before, that quiet ache of what if echoing in your chest late at night. Not loud, not sharp, just persistent. A soft pulse in the silence, whispering of paths not taken, words not spoken, and doors you never pushed open. Regret doesn't usually arrive in grand gestures. It comes in small, familiar shadows, lingering around the edges of your thoughts, curling up beside you when things finally grow quiet enough to feel. Here's a gentle truth. You will never be able to control the world, but you can always choose how you respond to it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie back and the hush of the room settles over you like a weighted blanket. A thought surfaces, something from long ago. Not a memory exactly, more like the feeling of one. It tugs at you gently, and without resistance you let it rise. It's a summer evening years past. You were offered a chance, a spontaneous invitation. Maybe it was a trip, a conversation, a confession, but instead you shook your head. Maybe next time, you said, though even then you knew there wouldn't be one. That moment still echoes sometimes, doesn't it? Stoicism teaches us not to grieve the past, but to learn from it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal not to chase things outside our control, because it is within that we find strength. And yet, to fully absorb that wisdom, we must first look at the shadows we've spent so long avoiding. You breathe in, slowly, and begin to trace the edges of your own unlived moments. No blame, no judgment, only awareness. There's a paradox here, an ironic twist that Stoics would appreciate. The very regret you fear facing is also what points you back to your true self. Regret isn't your enemy. It's your inner compass, misused perhaps but not broken. As you lie still, you start noticing how many of your what-ifs aren't even about huge, dramatic choices. They're smaller than that, so much smaller. A walk you didn't take, a question you were too scared to ask, a project you kept postponing. They stack, don't they? Like dust on furniture you meant to wipe clean, and the longer you avoid them, the more they begin to shape you in silence. A philosopher once mused that the most tragic lives are not those filled with failure, but those lived carefully enough to avoid both failure and fulfillment. You might wonder, is there still time? That's not a bad question, but maybe a better one is, what are you willing to face right now in this still moment about the life you've left untouched? Because right here, tonight, you're not being asked to fix your whole life. You're just being asked to notice, to soften, to breathe. You're asked to see that this ache you carry isn't here to punish you. It's here to wake you up. And the Stoics would say, if it wakes you up, then it's already served its purpose. You recall how sometimes we fear regret more than failure, because regret is quiet, personal. It doesn't draw applause or pity. It lives behind our eyes and speaks only in private, but it speaks, so you listen. And in the silence of your room, in the hush of your own thoughts, you begin to feel something shift. The ache is still there, but now it has shape, a boundary, a beginning. And where there is a beginning, there might just be a way through. The memory comes before you fully realize it. A soft flicker, like candlelight behind a curtain, of a day you once lived through carelessly, not knowing it might matter later. A laugh you could have joined in. A step you didn't take. A goodbye you didn't say with enough presence. You revisit it now, not to change it, but to observe, to see what it has to teach. There were moments you let slip away, not because you were cruel or careless, but simply distracted, maybe overwhelmed, or waiting for the perfect conditions that never came. You told yourself you'd have time later, that life would give you another round. But time, as it turns out, is a quiet thief. It takes things without ceremony. The Stoics warned us you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. They weren't being morbid. They were being honest. Memento mori. Remember that you must die not to scare you but to sharpen you. You shift under the blanket, the thought curling closer. You think about how many small invitations life has sent your way. Subtle, undramatic, moments that whispered, "This matters," but you didn't quite listen. A loved one reaching for connection. A fleeting opportunity that felt inconvenient. A creative impulse you stuffed under your routine. Even now, your body recalls the missed rhythm of those minutes. The times you stared at a phone screen while someone across from you was trying to make eye contact. The times you said, "I'm too tired," when your soul was aching for experience, not rest. No one blamed you. Not even you, really. But the regret stayed behind like footprints in wet sand. And here comes the paradox. It's not the giant life decisions that echo the loudest. It's the accumulation of missed presence. Of not being there, really there, for the life that was trying to meet you. Tonight, you let yourself see that. Not to punish yourself, but to reconnect. Because attention is a form of love. And where your attention goes, your life follows. You think of Epictetus, who reminded us, some things are up to us and some things are not. You didn't always get to choose what happened, but you always had a say in how you showed up. The missed moments weren't about failure. They were about forgetting what was truly within your power. The sound of your breath brings you back, slow, steady. You imagine yourself sitting at a park bench years ago, the sunlight hitting your face. That day happened. You were there. But were you really there? That's the question that stirs now. It's tempting to fall into the spiral of "I should have done more." But tonight, we resist that urge. Instead, we replace it with curiosity. What would it look like to be present now, fully? You begin to see each missed moment not as a wound, but as a lantern. A quiet signal pointing toward the kind of life you truly long for. One with intention, slowness, stillness. One where you look up more often, speak with a little more courage, reach out before it's too late. There's a gentle irony here. The more you notice what you've missed, the more alive you become. Awareness doesn't drag you back, it lifts you up. It's like that feeling when you watch an old home video and realize you were in the background the whole time, smiling faintly, unaware of the lens. You were there, but something in you had gone dim. Now you breathe life back into that version of you, not to relive it but to honor it. And you begin to see the thread, the missed moments, the regrets. They're not dead ends. They're doorways. And every doorway, even the painful ones, leads somewhere if you're brave enough to walk through. There's a quiet Stoic truth nestled in this realization. Regret is not a life sentence. It is a signal. A flare from the depths of your soul reminding you, you were meant to be awake. You were built for presence, not postponement. You settle deeper into the quiet, and a question rises like fog over a morning field. What moment have I been waiting to live, not someday? But now, no pressure, just honesty. As you lie there, the room unchanged, something inside begins to soften. The ache is still here, but so is the willingness to feel it. And feeling, as you begin to remember, is the first sign that you're coming back to life. Somewhere inside, you remember the crossroads, not a dramatic one, not one of those movie scene decisions, but the quiet kind. The kind no one saw you hesitate over. The kind that looked like nothing from the outside. You had a choice, to leap or to stay where it was safe. And you chose comfort. You told yourself it was wisdom, maturity, patience. But a small part of you knew it was fear. You didn't speak up, didn't try, didn't reach. Because the unknown felt too wide and the familiar, however dull, was at least predictable. Tonight, that version of you stands in your memory like a shadow behind glass. Close, but unreachable. This is not about blame. The Stoics would never ask you to berate yourself for fear. They knew fear was part of being human. Even the great Emperor Marcus Aurelius doubted himself while commanding armies and facing illness. What he learned, and wrote again and again, was this: it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. And fear, unquestioned, becomes a kind of judgment. A silent decree that says, you can't handle what's next, but here's a truth you may have forgotten. You can. You trace back your hesitation, maybe to the job you didn't apply for, the words you didn't say to someone you loved, The path you wanted to follow but talked yourself out of. Your reasons sounded logical. It's not the right time. I'm not ready yet. What if it doesn't work? But buried beneath all that logic was something more tender. The belief that you weren't enough. The Stoics wouldn't waste time arguing with your feelings. They'd simply remind you, courage is a choice, not a mood. And you can choose it without fanfare, without waiting to feel fearless. You can choose it even now, lying still in the dark. You see now that comfort is not peace. Comfort is the couch you sink into while your dreams dry up. You might think back to a conversation that could have changed everything. You were on the edge of saying something real, but you pulled back. You nodded politely, smiled, let it go. And now, late at night, you wonder what might have bloomed if you had been a little braver. There's a tender irony here, too. Often the pain of regret grows louder than the fear that kept you still. And you realize, fear protects you from pain, but it also protects you from joy, from discovery, from becoming. You wonder what kind of person you could have become had you stepped through the fear. Would you have failed? Maybe, but failure is movement, it's a life in motion. And regret is stillness, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that calcifies. The Stoics saw failure as essential. Seneca wrote of how storms make sailors better. Adversity is a teacher. Avoid it and you avoid your own growth. Face it and you expand. So now, lying in this room, long after that decision has passed, you ask a different question. What would I have learned if I had tried? Not would I have succeeded, but what might I have discovered? The world will always offer you a reason to stay comfortable, but your soul will always whisper something harder and truer. Move. You don't need to rush. This is not a call to recklessness. This is simply a gentle reminder that fear should not be your compass. Fear doesn't know where you're going. It only knows where you've been hurt before. And while you're lying here years later, what echoes isn't the failure, it's the silence. You close your eyes and for a moment, imagine who you would have become had you stepped forward that day. Not some idealized version of success, but a version of yourself who knew you were brave. That version still lives inside you, waiting, patient, quiet, ready when you are. And perhaps tonight is not about making the leap. Perhaps tonight is just about remembering that you once stood at the edge. And next time, you might just take the step. You breathe into the thought that's been hovering quietly for years. Who might you have become if you had said yes more often to what truly mattered? Not yes to obligations, not yes to noise, but yes to yourself. You imagine those unlived lives, branching out from your own like quiet tributaries of a river never followed. The version of you who moved to that city, who said yes to that unexpected offer, who pursued that wild creative dream, who loved more openly, who walked away sooner, who stayed and made it work, who left and let it go. All these versions flicker in the mind like shadows on a cave wall. This is where regret grows loud, not because you failed, but because you never got to know who you might have become. That not knowing hums at the edge of your awareness like a note left unresolved. The Stoics would remind you, you are not owed every version of yourself. You are only ever given one path at a time. But that does not mean you shouldn't reflect on the others, because what you grieve reveals what you value. The unlived lives are not mistakes, they are messengers. They tell you what your soul still longs for. There's a story passed down of Cato the Younger, the Stoic senator who refused to compromise his values even as Rome collapsed into corruption. He could have chosen ease, alignment, silence, but he didn't. Not because he was fearless, but because he refused to betray what he knew to be right. He lived one life fiercely, and he owned every moment of it. You ask yourself now, have I lived like that even once? With full presence, full integrity, full risk. You shift beneath the covers, not uncomfortably, just aware now of the weight of choices you never made. And yet here is where we flip the lens, where philosophy softens the ache. Because while you can't live every version of your life, you can choose to live this one more deeply, more consciously. You can begin again, not at the beginning, but at the edge of this very breath. There's a strange comfort in realizing you didn't miss everything. You're still here. You're still breathing. And somewhere in that, possibility remains. So you ask a gentler question now: which part of me have I silenced for too long? The one who wanted to write, to speak, to forgive. The one who wanted to leave the job or return to the old friend. The one who was curious about something everyone else said was not practical. Even in regret, there's a trace of longing. And longing is evidence of life still stirring within. It's not too late for that part of you. The path may look different now, more subtle, maybe smaller, but the essence of it is still within reach. A teacher once said, "We never truly lose our dreams. We just misplace them in rooms we stop visiting." Tonight, you knock gently on one of those doors. And here's the paradox that Stoicism loves most. The more clearly you see what you cannot live, the more fully you can commit to the life you do have. The unlived lives aren't enemies, they're guides. They teach you to be more deliberate with this day, this hour, this moment. You remember that your power is not in wishing the past different, but in waking up to the present with fuller attention. So tonight, let yourself grieve, not with despair but with clarity. Grieve the paths you didn't take, so you can walk more honestly on the one you're still on. You don't need to become all your possible selves. You just need to stop abandoning the one you already are. And as you settle deeper into the night, you whisper a quiet promise inward. I may not get to live every life I imagined, but I will live this one fully. I will not drift through the days I still have left. The silence that follows feels different now. Less like absence, more like space. A thought surfaces gently now, when you've carried quietly for years. Whose life have I really been living? It's subtle at first, almost rhetorical, but it begins to stretch wider the more you let it linger. Was it the life you chose or the life you were handed? Did you build this path intentionally, or did you drift onto it, step by step, while following signs planted by other people? You begin to see how expectations, so silent, so woven into the background, became the map you followed. Not always consciously, not maliciously, but steadily, quietly. And now, looking back, you wonder, how many decisions were truly mine? The Stoics warned against external validation. They taught that if you let praise guide you, you become a slave to it. Epictetus said, if you wish to be free, then learn to live as you are, not as others demand you to be. You think of the times you pursued things not because they lit you up, but because they looked good on paper. The achievements that felt empty once earned. The goals that weren't really yours, but sounded impressive, so you reach for them anyway. There's a kind of regret that blooms not from failure but from misalignment. From realizing you climbed a ladder that was leaning against the wrong wall. You let yourself feel that now, not in anger, not in shame, but in truth. Because truth is what liberates you. You recall how easily we inherit expectations from parents, teachers, society. Not as commands, but as quiet suggestions, repeated often enough to become internal laws. Be successful, be stable, be liked, be useful, be productive, but rarely be yourself. And so you built a self that performed, a self that adapted, and somewhere along the way the truer voice, the quiet one, got drowned out by the noise. There's a paradox here, a kind of cosmic joke the Stoics might smirk at. You spent years chasing a life to make others proud, and now you carry the regret of having ignored your own soul. You take a deep breath. This isn't to say their expectations were wrong. Maybe they meant well. Maybe they loved you in the only language they knew, but somewhere in the translation something got lost. You. And tonight, in the quiet, you begin to translate yourself back. You remember that your worth isn't tied to productivity. That freedom isn't the absence of responsibility, but the presence of authenticity. You don't have to burn everything down to begin again. You just have to stop lying to yourself about what actually matters. The Stoics didn't believe in self-indulgence, but they deeply believed in self-honesty. And this is what you practice now, not self-blame but self-honesty. You begin to ask, if I had no one to impress, what would I be doing differently? If no one was watching, what would I allow myself to pursue, to rest from, to love? You won't have all the answers tonight, but the questions themselves are enough. They mark the edge of your return. There's another irony to hold gently. Often, we fear disappointing others more than we fear disappointing ourselves. But the longer you live someone else's life, the more distant you become from your own. And slowly the body feels that disconnection. In fatigue, in restlessness, in the ache behind your ribs when everything else is quiet. So tonight, you trace those aches back to their source, and you let yourself name them. This ache is the job I stayed in too long. This ache is the silence I kept to keep the peace. This ache is the version of me I abandoned because they said it was too much. This ache is the dream I laughed off before anyone else could dismiss it first. And still, beneath it all, something remains unbroken. Your capacity to choose again, to realign, to whisper, I am still here. I am still listening. The Stoics' new freedom begins not in changing the world but in freeing the self from false obligation, from the belief that you must be what others decided. You have nothing to prove, and from this quiet place you begin to feel something new flicker beneath the regret, not guilt, not shame, but possibility. You can be shaped by your past without being shackled to it, so you lie still, but inside something has already begun to move. The clock ticks softly in the distance, steady and indifferent, and you start to feel the truth you've been circling all along. Time has never waited, not for your hesitation, not for your perfect moment, not for your readiness. You thought you had more of it. You assumed that one day you begin living as you meant to. But one day quietly became someday, and someday kept slipping further out of reach. The Stoics would call this out gently but directly. You are dying each day. Not all at once, but moment by moment. Every hour that passes is an hour you cannot hold again. And yet, it's not morbid. It's clarifying. Because when you accept the impermanence of time, you begin to value the permanence of presence. You recall how you used to say, I'll start when I feel more confident, when things settle down, when the timing is right. But things rarely settle, and time rarely announces itself as right. You don't run out of time all at once. You leak it through distraction, through delay, through saying yes to what drains you and no to what lights you up. You roll slightly under the covers, feeling the softness of fabric against your skin. That simple touch reminds you you're still alive, still here, still inside this moment. But you also begin to see how much of your life you've postponed, not deliberately, just gradually. And that is how most people miss their lives. Not in sudden catastrophes, but in the gentle erosion of waiting. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." You don't need more time. You need to stop giving your time away to things that do not nourish you. You remember now the hours lost to overthinking, to scrolling, to performing a version of yourself for approval you weren't even sure you needed. You think of the days that blurred into each other, each one feeling like a rehearsal for the real thing. But the real thing never came, because it was always now. That's the bittersweet truth. This moment, however quiet, however small, is life. It's not the pause before your real life. It is your real life. And yes, that can feel overwhelming, even sorrowful, but it can also feel liberating, because it means you don't have to wait to begin again. The freedom you thought belonged to the future is available now, in the decision to show up for what matters, even in miniature. You ask yourself softly, what am I still postponing that matters more than I've admitted? A relationship, a dream, an apology, a decision that scares you because it's real. You let that question sit in your chest. You don't rush to answer it, because sometimes just holding the question changes everything. There's a gentle irony here. We spend so long trying to buy time, but the only thing that buys us life is presence. Tonight, in this quiet room, you realize you don't want to keep counting the days. You want to make the days count, even if that means starting small, especially if it means starting small. The Stoics lived with urgency, not panic but purpose, because they knew time is not a guarantee. And waiting for life to begin is a form of forgetting that you are already in it. So you take one breath fully, then another, and slowly you begin to reclaim what is still yours. Not all of it, but this hour, this night, this heartbeat. And perhaps that is enough. The small things return first, not the dramatic regrets but the ones so quiet they almost slipped beneath your awareness. The text you never replied to, the smile you didn't return, the idea you jotted down, then buried under doubt. You start to realize just how much weight the small regrets carry, not because each one was monumental, but because together they formed a rhythm, a slow, subtle hum of disengagement from your own life. And now, lying here in the dim light, you listen to that hum differently. You let it speak. The Stoics taught that character is formed not in grand gestures but in daily practice. Epictetus said, "You become what you give your attention to." And when you look back, you see that what you neglected didn't vanish, it stayed, like soft shadows trailing behind you. You think of the people you meant to call, the hobbies you promised yourself you'd return to, the walks you intended to take at sunset, but traded for another hour at the desk. Regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it lives in the sigh you don't even realize you make, the one that slips out when a memory brushes past you, uninvited. You begin to see how those small decisions, repeated over time, quietly shaped your sense of self. They taught you that your desires could wait, that your voice was optional, that your needs were negotiable. But were they? There's a paradox here, of course. The very discipline that Stoicism teaches can sometimes harden into avoidance when misunderstood. Stoicism isn't about suppressing what matters. It's about seeing clearly and choosing wisely. And wisdom means admitting some of those small regrets still sting, but instead of recoiling, you turn toward them. You name them softly. The dinner you canceled last minute, the friend you didn't check in on when they drifted away, the thing you built halfway, then abandoned, not because it failed, but because you didn't believe you deserved to finish it. You hold them now like fragile stones in your hand. You don't throw them away, you observe their weight, their texture, their truth, and slowly something shifts. You realize that these regrets do not define you, they simply remind you of what matters, of where you want to return, of who you want to be even now. There's a soft irony the Stoics might smile at. We often believe regret is a sign of weakness, but really it is a sign of awareness. Only those who are awake can regret. Only those who care can feel the sting of what was missed. And that caring, that sting, is a kind of compass. So you ask yourself gently, what would it look like to begin again in the small things, to reply to that message, to take that walk, to sit for 10 quiet minutes with a cup of tea and no distractions, not to fix the past, but to reconnect with the thread of your life. Because every small regret points to a small act of love, one that's still waiting for you to return. You don't have to start with something big. In fact, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe the way through regret is not with grand resolutions, but with subtle consistency. Like the way water shapes stone, slowly, gently, persistently. And so you take a breath. And with it, you let yourself believe. You are allowed to re-enter your life through the smallest door. The Stoics would call that door virtue. Not the rigid, moralizing kind, but the quiet excellence of showing up as your fullest self in everyday moments. And perhaps that's what these regrets have been trying to teach you all along, that your life is still waiting for you to notice the small things. Because in the end, they were never small at all. The shape of a face comes to mind now, familiar but softened by time. Not someone you lost tragically, just someone who slipped out of your life like mist fading in morning light. You didn't fight the drift. Maybe you didn't even notice it at first. It started with longer pauses between messages, plans delayed, then quietly forgotten. You told yourself it was natural. Life gets busy. People grow apart. No one's at fault. But here in the stillness, a question returns. Could I have held on just a little more tightly? The Stoics teach us to accept change, to let go with grace, to understand that nothing, no person, no bond, is truly ours to keep. But acceptance isn't indifference. And sometimes, what we label letting go is just a softer name for inattention. You think now of the friend who reached out during a hard time and you replied too late. The sibling you assumed would always be around, until they weren't. the mentor who gave you everything, and you never said thank you properly. The laughter you once shared with someone who now feels like a stranger. Regret moves differently in relationships. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arrives in silence. In the absence of a voice you didn't realize you missed until one quiet night, like this one, it's gone too long unheard. You begin to trace the gentle erosion. A birthday you forgot. A hug you didn't return with enough presence. A message you were too proud or too uncertain to send. There's a kind of sorrow here that isn't dramatic but deeply human. You thought you had more time with them. You always do. The Stoics understood this, too. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to treasure those around him, because no moment with them was guaranteed. You may never see them again. Treat each interaction as if it were the last. Not to frighten yourself, but to soften, to remember how sacred even the ordinary can be. You wonder now, who did I stop showing up for without realizing it? And more importantly, who might still be within reach if I tried again? Because not all faded connections are lost. Some are simply waiting for warmth to return, not with fireworks but with a message, a phone call, a gesture that says, I still remember, I still care. There's a bittersweet paradox at play here. We often fear reaching out because it feels awkward, vulnerable, too late. But rarely do we ask, what's the cost of silence? The Stoics wouldn't tell you to chase every person who leaves, but they'd remind you, don't confuse pride with peace. Sometimes, the peace you long for lives just beyond one honest sentence. I'm sorry I drifted. I've been thinking of you. Want to catch up sometime? You shift gently, and you notice something unexpected. This regret, painful as it is, has opened your heart just a little wider, because now you know. You don't want to let people fade so easily anymore. You want to cherish more actively, to be present in your connections, not as a duty but as a choice. A conscious act of love, and that's the quiet beauty regret offers you if you listen. It reminds you that you can still choose who to become, not in theory, but in relationship. So tonight, you allow yourself to feel the ache, and in doing so, you rediscover your capacity to reach. Maybe you'll send a message tomorrow. Maybe not yet, but the intention has returned. The door is unlocked, and somewhere out there, someone might be quietly hoping that you remember them too. It's a soft ache, this one, almost a whisper. You remember someone, not vividly, not with sharp pain, but with the heaviness of something unfinished. Someone you once loved or almost loved, or maybe you never said the words at all. You wonder what might have unfolded if you had spoken up. If you had looked them in the eye and let your guard fall just long enough to say, I feel something. But you didn't. You smiled instead. You stayed safe. And now the memory rests in you like a sealed envelope, never opened, never read aloud. There's a peculiar form of regret that comes from love unspoken, not from rejection, not from heartbreak, but from the silence that grew where vulnerability might have bloomed. The Stoics remind us to speak truth, to live in accordance with nature, which includes the nature of your own heart. Yet it's easy to mistake silence for strength, to believe that withholding is wiser than risking pain. But is it? You lie there now, years later, and the moment still lives in you. You can still feel the pull in your chest, the way your hand nearly reached for theirs, the conversation that circled and circled, never landing. You tell yourself it was nothing. But if it were nothing, why does it still visit you in the quiet? The philosopher Musonius Rufus once said, to love well is to live wisely. And loving well, as you begin to understand, sometimes means saying the thing that feels most impossible. You wonder, what would have happened if I had let myself be seen, not performatively, not perfectly, just honestly. You remember how your heart beat faster when they were near, the way your thoughts stretched toward them without permission, and how instead of leaning in, you folded inwards. Maybe it wasn't the right time. Maybe they wouldn't have returned the feeling, but that's not what lingers now. What lingers is the not knowing. Because the longer you live, the more you learn. Uncertainty is easier to face than silence that calcifies into regret. There's a paradox here, the kind the Stoics quietly smile at. Love, when unspoken, doesn't disappear. It becomes a lesson, not a punishment, but a mirror. A mirror showing you the parts of yourself you once hid, and maybe still do. You shift slightly under the covers, not to run from the thought but to meet it with gentleness. What if you had said it? What if just once you had let the words come out, stumbling, clumsy, real? You'll never know what they might have said, but you would have known something else, that you had shown up for your own heart. The Stoics never promised safety. They promised strength through clarity. And clarity comes not from perfect timing but from honest living. You breathe in, long and low, and suddenly you realize this regret isn't asking for you to go back. It's asking for you to go forward differently, to no longer treat love like a secret, to no longer let fear make your decisions, to no longer live like vulnerability is weakness. It isn't. Vulnerability is presence. Vulnerability is truth. And truth is what Stoicism was always pointing toward, not detachment but discipline in the service of what really matters. So you ask yourself softly, who do I care for now, and am I letting them know? Not grand declarations, just presence, just kindness, just attention. Love isn't always fireworks. Sometimes it's a single sentence spoken before it's too late. And if you carry one promise forward from this moment, let it be this: that you will not let fear speak louder than your heart again, not when it matters. The memory fades a little now, not because it's gone, but because you've seen it clearly. And in seeing it, you've released some of its grip. That sealed envelope will never be opened, but the one in your chest, you're opening that now. The quiet deepens now, not just around you, but within you. A kind of settling, like dust finding its place on still furniture after a long-forgotten movement. You've been visiting echoes of choices not made, words not said, paths not walked. And yet, beneath all those layers, one echo rings louder than the rest. You forgot to trust yourself. Not all regret stems from what others did to you. Some of the deepest regrets come from the ways you abandoned your own inner knowing. You remember the times you knew, instinctively, unmistakably, that something wasn't right, but you went along anyway. You laughed when you wanted to speak. You stayed when your body begged you to leave. You tolerated when your intuition screamed no. And afterwards you told yourself it wasn't a big deal. You rationalized, smoothed the edges, called it compromise, but a quiet voice remained. The one you didn't listen to. The Stoics would nod at this moment, because they knew the power of inner authority, of aligning with your logos, your rational, moral self. Epictetus wrote, "No person is free unless they master themselves." And part of that mastery is listening, really listening. You ask yourself now, when did I begin to doubt my own compass? Was it one big moment or a slow forgetting? Maybe you remember a time when you sensed the truth about a person, but you silenced it to keep the peace. Or when your heart leaned one way, but you deferred to logic, to others' opinions, to the loudest voice in the room. It seemed easier at the time. Until, one day, you looked in the mirror and couldn't quite hear yourself anymore. There's an irony here, the Stoic kind. The world often teaches you to doubt your feelings in the name of reason. But true reason doesn't drown emotion, it partners with it. It guides it toward clarity, not suppression. The regret you feel now isn't because you didn't know what to do. It's because you knew and didn't follow through. And so tonight, as you lie still beneath the hush of the room, you consider what it might look like to return to yourself. Not in a dramatic rebirth, but in quiet, steady reconnection. To pause when your body tightens, to speak when your voice rises, to say no without apology, to say yes without guilt. The Stoics taught that virtue begins within. It's not about obeying rules. It's about living from a place of alignment with who you are at your core. So you ask yourself gently, what would it feel like to trust myself again? Not to be right all the time, but to be in relationship with yourself again. To hear your own voice without flinching. To act on your truth without asking for permission. This kind of self-trust isn't loud. It's not arrogance. It's quiet conviction. The kind that says, even if no one understands, I know this is the right step for me. And even if it's messy, especially when it's messy, you walk that path anyway. Because the deeper regret you now realize is not in the mistakes you made. It's in the times you let someone else's map replace your own. You take a long, slow breath. Regret shows you where you stopped listening, but it also shows you that the voice is still there, buried under doubt, under conditioning, under the pressure to conform, but not gone, never gone. And maybe that's the most hopeful truth of all, that the part of you who knows is still waiting, not resentful, just patient. So tonight, maybe you don't need answers. Maybe you just need to begin asking again. What do I truly feel? What do I deeply want? And am I willing to listen this time? No rush, no pressure. Just the promise that next time, when your inner knowing speaks, you won't look away. The thought that rises now doesn't come with a sharp edge. It arrives more like a fog, slow, diffuse, and undeniable. It's the quiet realization that you've spent too much of your life performing, not in some theatrical way, just subtly, presenting what you thought others needed, smoothing out your roughness, curating your reactions, becoming palatable. You didn't call it a performance. You called it maturity, professionalism, being easy to be around. But under all those names, a truth was buried. You forgot how to be real. The Stoics warned against this, not because they feared society, but because they knew how quickly the self can dissolve when it's shaped entirely by others. Seneca once said, "Associate with those who will make a better man of you. Welcome those whom you yourself can improve." The process is mutual, for men learn while they teach. What he meant was this: surround yourself with truth, not applause, because applause fades, but truth, that builds character. You begin to remember the subtle moments of distortion. When you laughed a little too hard at the joke that made you uncomfortable. When you dressed a certain way to fit in. When you nodded in agreement, not because you agreed, but because you were tired of being too much. And with each little adjustment, the real you stepped a little further back. Not gone, just dimmed. You think now of the times you said, "I'm fine," when you weren't. The times you wore a smile like armor. The times you were praised for being so strong when what you really needed was to fall apart, just a little. There's a soft kind of grief in realizing how long you've kept yourself edited. And it's not because anyone asked you to be fake. It's because you learned that being fully yourself came with risk. But now you wonder, what did it cost me to always be performing? You don't feel anger. You feel tired. Tired of managing other people's impressions of you. Tired of shrinking your sadness into quiet corners. Tired of being agreeable instead of being whole. The Stoics were not performers. They were seekers. And they believed that the good life wasn't one of outward success, but inward harmony. A life where your actions align with your values, where your face doesn't betray your soul. You take a breath now, not the shallow kind, but a full one. And you wonder, what would it look like to show up as myself without apology? To say, "I don't know," when you don't know. To say, "I'm struggling," without dressing it up as a joke. To say, "This matters to me," even when others don't understand why. There's an irony here, isn't there? We perform to feel accepted. But real connection only happens when we stop performing. You think of the people in your life. Who knows the real you? Have you given anyone that chance? And deeper still, have you given yourself that chance? To not just tolerate who you are, but to fully occupy yourself. Flaws, contradictions, softness, depth. The Stoics would ask, are you living in accordance with your nature? Because pretending to be someone else, no matter how skillfully, always leads back to discontent. And regret doesn't just grow from wrong decisions. It grows from unlived authenticity. So tonight you let yourself loosen the mask just a little. You speak inwardly, "This is who I am. This is where I'm at. This is enough for now." No performance, no polish, just presence. And maybe that's the first step to becoming whole again. Not changing, but reuniting with the parts of you that got pushed aside. Because in the end, the role you've been playing can never feel as right as the truth you've been hiding. It begins now with a feeling, not a memory, but a weight. Like carrying a backpack for so long you forget it's even there. But the straps have cut into your shoulders, and tonight, finally, you notice the ache. The burden is this: trying to control what was never yours to hold. You look back on the moments where you grasped too tightly, trying to predict outcomes, manage other people's reactions, shape the future like clay between your fingers, and somewhere along the way you confused vigilance with responsibility. You thought if you planned better, tried harder, stayed alert long enough, you could avoid pain. But pain came anyway, not because you failed, but because control was never the point. The Stoics placed this idea at the center of everything. There are things you can control, and things you cannot. The line between them is where peace begins. You think now of the jobs you overworked for, the people you couldn't save, the relationships you tried to fix beyond their expiration. You thought effort would guarantee results, but results arrived according to their own rhythm. Sometimes just, sometimes cruel, often unpredictable, and your body remembers this truth better than your mind. The tension in your shoulders, the shallow breath when waiting for a reply, the racing thoughts before a big decision, all signs of trying to grip life too tightly. You sigh now not from defeat, but from recognition. I did what I could, and that was enough. There's a freedom that comes not from more effort, but from surrender, not passive resignation, but wise relinquishment. You remember the story of Marcus Aurelius, writing in his journal during war, during sickness, during betrayal. He still made decisions, he still showed up, but he also reminded himself daily, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. He was emperor, and even he knew he could not control the world. So why do you think you must? You ask yourself now, what have I been clinging to that is no longer mine to manage? Someone's opinion, an old failure, a version of the future that no longer fits. And beneath that, what have I neglected because I was so focused on what I couldn't control? Your own peace, your health, your joy, your presence in moments that passed unnoticed while your mind wandered into the future. There's a paradox here, soft and undeniable. The tighter you grip, the more life slips through your fingers. But when you loosen your hold, life returns, not perfectly but authentically. So tonight you release something, not because it doesn't matter, but because you matter more. You say inwardly, I do not control the outcomes. I only control how I show up. And suddenly, the weight lessens. You feel it in your jaw, your chest, your breath. Like setting down a load you didn't realize you were carrying. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to know how it all turns out. You don't even have to be ready. You just have to be here, aware, aligned. That is where your power lives. That is what the Stoics meant by freedom, not the absence of chaos, but the refusal to be owned by it. So you lie still now and say quietly, what's mine to hold I will hold with care. What's not mine I will set down, and in that space I will breathe. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels full, like something has settled, like the noise has finally left the room, and in that stillness a deeper thought arrives. You spent a long time living by shoulds. I should be further along by now. I should be more successful. I should have figured it out. I should be happier. Each should a whisper in your mind, handed down by teachers, parents, culture, timelines that were never really yours. You followed them for years, and they gave you structure, but also pressure, also shame. The Stoics didn't trade in shoulds. They spoke in terms of what is, not to excuse passivity, but to cut through illusion. They taught, don't argue with reality, work with it. Not the fantasy of who you wish you were, but the truth of who you are right now in this breath. And so you sit with the discomfort that you haven't lived every dream, that you've made detours, that some of the timelines unraveled, that some of them were never real to begin with. You feel the urge to judge yourself, to catalog all the ways you fell short, but instead you stay. You breathe. You observe the urge and let it pass. You ask yourself, where did these shoulds come from? Who decided that success looks like this? That happiness means that you must hit every milestone by a certain age. You begin to see the absurdity of it. How arbitrary, how manufactured. A paradox emerges, the kind the Stoics loved. The more you chase the life you should have, the further you drift from the life you do have. and that life, your real life, is where your peace lives. It's not in comparison. It's in connection, not in expectation, but in embodiment. You take inventory now, not of achievements but of alignment. Are you living in harmony with your own nature? Are your days shaped by what matters to you or by what you think will earn approval? You recall the words of Epictetus, not a command but a challenge. First say to yourself what you would be. Then do what you must, not what others expect, not what the world demands, what you would be. So you imagine that now. What if you let go of every should, every metric that never belonged to you, every role you wore because it seemed noble or safe or pleasing? What would be left? Maybe something quieter, maybe something smaller, but maybe, just maybe, something more real. You realize now that regret often grows in the soil of should. It feeds on the gap between your truth and your performance, between your essence and your imitation. And so you make a small vow, not a resolution, a return, to choose more often from the inside out, to listen more closely to the voice that says this is mine, and to step away gently from the voices that say this is expected. The Stoics weren't emotionless statues. They were disciplined enough to know what was theirs to live, and courageous enough to let go of the rest. You have that courage, too. So tonight you rest, not as someone behind or ahead, not as a project to be fixed, but as someone exactly where they need to be, because this is where you are. And that, for now, is enough. Somewhere beneath all the layers, regret, reflection, memory, and ache, something surprising begins to emerge. Gratitude. It doesn't arrive in the way you expected, not as a flash of joy, not as a dramatic realization, but as a warm, steady undercurrent, a presence. You realize for all that went unlived you are still here, and that means something. You have felt deeply, you have lost and remembered, you have turned toward the truth instead of away from it. And that in itself is a kind of grace. The Stoics called this amor fati, the love of fate, not just acceptance but a deep embrace of all that is, even the mistakes, even the missteps, even the parts you wish had gone differently. Because without them you would not be who you are right now, awake, aware, and turning inward with honesty. You remember now you are not a timeline, not a resume, not a clean narrative. You are a collection of choices, yes, but also of courage, of tiny moments where you chose to stay open, of quiet evenings like this when you could have distracted yourself but instead you looked inward. That is not failure. That is fortitude. You think of Marcus Aurelius again, scribbling notes to himself by candlelight while the empire trembled outside his door, not to impress others, not to perform, but to remember what was true. You can begin again in this breath. He wrote that not for others but for himself. And now for you, you begin to see the gifts hidden in the regrets, not as punishments but as messengers. They brought you clarity. They cut through the noise. You wouldn't wish them back, but you also wouldn't trade the wisdom they gave you. There's a paradox here, the final kind maybe. Regret doesn't mean you lived wrong. Sometimes it means you cared deeply enough to want to live more honestly. And caring, truly caring, is not a weakness. It is a sign of a life that feels. The Stoics would remind you, pain is inevitable, but suffering is often a result of resistance. And tonight you did not resist. You stayed with it. You softened. You ask yourself one final question. What would it look like to live forward not from fear but from love, not as penance, but as expression, not to make up for time lost, but to honor what remains? Because there is still so much that remains. Time, choice, presence, love. The path doesn't need to be clear, it only needs to be honest. And honesty begins like this, with the willingness to see, to feel, to forgive, not just others but yourself. Especially yourself. You take one more breath, a little deeper this time. You feel the space you've made inside yourself, cleared by truth, lit by understanding. And for the first time in a long time, perhaps, you are not haunted by what could have been. You are held by what still is. Tonight feels different now, not because anything outside has changed. The world still turns, the fan still hums, but you've shifted, not entirely, not permanently, but enough. enough to feel a deeper quiet. Not the numb kind, the open kind, the kind that comes after release. You're not chasing anymore. Not the past, not the approval, not the life that was supposed to happen. You're here. And with that stillness comes the final echo of this long, winding reflection. You are not too late. You thought for so long that you had missed it. The right time, the right version of yourself, the ideal path. But now in this slowness you see the truth. There is no perfect timing. There is only now. And now is always enough to begin again. The Stoics never taught that life would be without regret. They simply taught that regret didn't have to define you, that you could greet it with clarity, with courage, and then use it as a teacher. You've done that tonight. You've traced the outlines of your unlived moments. You've sat with them. You've seen how much was built not just from choices made, but from truths ignored, fears obeyed, tenderness postponed. And yet, here you are. The unlived life does not mean you have failed. It means you are human. It means you are still becoming. And in that becoming, you now carry something new, not just awareness, but gentleness. Gentleness for who you were, for the person who did the best they could with the tools they had, for the younger self who was scared, proud, uncertain, hopeful. You don't have to abandon them. You just don't have to be them anymore. You ask yourself now, what would it mean to live forward, not in the shadow of regret, but in the light of renewal? And the answer isn't grand. It's not a reinvention. It's a remembering, to wake up tomorrow with even a little more attention, to speak your truth just a little sooner, to soften when you want to hide, to offer what you once withheld. This is how the unlived life becomes lived, not through sweeping change, but through the decision to be present again, and again, and again. The Stoics taught that philosophy wasn't about words, it was about action. The daily practice of choosing to live with virtue, clarity, humility, and depth. And so, as this reflection draws to a close, you do not make a resolution. You make space for the new, for the true, for the version of you that does not need to escape the past, because they've learned from it. And as your breath slows, as your body sinks deeper into the warmth of rest, you remember the most stoic truth of all. You are here. You are awake. You are free. Now let's bring this night to a close. Let everything slow now. Let the echoes of memory dissolve like mist in the morning. You've walked a long path tonight, not through places, but through truths. You've faced what was avoided. You've sat beside what once felt unbearable. You've listened to your own heart without running. And that alone is a kind of courage most never practice. So now rest. Let go of questions. Let go of analysis. Let go of the effort to change anything. There is nothing more to fix in this moment. There is nothing more to reach for. You have seen yourself clearly, gently, and that is enough. Breathe in, not with force but with welcome. Breathe out, like a wave receding quietly into the sea. Feel your hands, your feet. Notice how the world has gone softer, not because it changed, but because you did. The mind no longer clutches. The body no longer braces. The heart no longer hides. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to be. You are allowed to feel peace, not because everything is resolved, but because you have stopped running from what is real. Let your breath guide you now. Let the stillness hold you. Let the unlived moments drift into the dark like leaves on water. They've done their work. They've brought you home. And home is right here.